Hello. I am so thankful to be back with you guys. I wasn't sure they were going to ask me back for a few reasons. Why are you already laughing? For a few reasons. One, I'm not Buck. If you didn't tell, I don't have his hair. I'm jealous of the volume of his hair. I also don't have a beautiful wife, Jill. I have a handsome husband, Sal. I'm not nearly as intelligent and witty as Jordan and as funny as the majority of the staff and communicators. And if you're kind of like been at Northpoint for a while, it's probably easy to grow accustomed to such amazing communicators. But having the opportunity to work at churches before, as well as what I do here in Austin, gives me the opportunity to interact with a lot of the area churches. You guys are very blessed to have such a strong group of communicators. So I wasn't sure I was going to get asked back. I'm also not a Longhorn fan. Man, the first service really didn't react well to that. Apparently, I've got some friends in here. So, and I always learn something new when I get to share with you guys. So, I just learned I have an accent. I didn't know that I sound like I'm from Tennessee. Jordan has expressed that. But probably the thing I've really been trying to process since the last time I was able to share with you guys was this comment that was made, and Jordan alluded to it, but, I'm still processing when Jeremy Edelin called me a seasoned communicator. Because we know, because anyone that just laughed knows, because seasoned means old. So really, honestly, that moment has sent me on, a little over a month of a journey of really questioning my mortality and trying to have a deeper understanding of how much longer I have as a seasoned communicator. In fact, I started doing some research about life expectancies. Did you know that globally the life expectancy is 72.6 years? I thought, okay, I got some time. I got a few years left. And I thought, but I need to understand a little more localized. So I went and I asked, Google, what is the U.S. life expectancy? And we're currently sitting at 78.99 years. And so I've just been thinking of my life as a timeline. And I figure, maybe I've got if I'm lucky, I've got 80, right? 10, 20, 30, right? And then I thought, you know what? I moved from Tennessee 3 years ago. I wonder if moving has changed my odds of life expectancy. So I looked at Tennessee's life expectancy, and a Tennessean is expected to live 75.5 years. And I thought, okay, still got more time, still higher than the global average. And I thought, well, I have this theory that Texas as a state with its vegetation and its wildlife is out to kill you. So my only thing I can assume is that you have a shorter life expectancy as a Texan. And guess what? I was wrong. Texans live 78.5 years. So, okay, yeah, the first service erupted in joy. And I thought, that is some serious state pride. You're we got 3 years on everybody nationally. We're so excited. We're going to live 3 years longer than Tennesseans. Honestly, I feel bad for Jeremy. I teased him about that a lot. But I do want us to number our days today. It's funny, as they did an original song, Jamie and the artists that were with him, and I have this thought that visual art and poetry and music actually have a way of communicating kind of what's inside us in a way that we just can't really put in words when we're just having everyday conversation, right? You guys know a song lyric every now and then just grabs you and you're yes, that's how I feel. That's what I've thought. Well, in the Bible, kind of toward the middle, is a book that's just a bunch of songs and poems. But it has this ability to communicate something. It's called Psalms, and we read it now. We put it on pallet wood from Hobby Lobby and stuff. But it really is just a lot of amazing lyrics that just highlight our humanity. It's got a bunch of highs and lows. And one of the things that the psalmist says is, teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Anybody need some more wisdom? Teach me to number my days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about numbering our days, and why would the psalmist tell that? What would be the value in knowing our days and what our timeline looks like? And what would be the value in acknowledging that others also have numbered days as well? I'm going to start this, though, by just sharing a story. Now, it's not going to be a particularly epic story. It's just a normal woman's life. It is not a celebrity or anything huge. One of the favorite things that one of my professors said to us when we were taking pastoral counseling classes, she said, there will be some stories that everyone relates to, right? There are some things that everyone can relate to, can connect with. There are other stories that only a few people can connect and relate with. And then there's also one story that is extremely unique, and it's yours. She would say our story is just like everyone else's in some ways, just like a few people's in some ways, and unlike anyone else's in some ways. So the story I'm going to share, there might be bits and pieces you can relate to. You might not be able to relate at all, but I'm hoping that in some way you can connect with this story because it's a super normal story, and we're going to look at what it looks like to number our days. So let's start our story. The story begins, this woman was born in Biloxi, Mississippi. Anybody from Biloxi, Mississippi here? No, I don't know why I would have even expected that, but we got people from Canada. I just figured maybe we have someone from Biloxi. So just born in Biloxi, Mississippi as a firstborn child to just kind of like that very typical 50s household, right? Like her father was an Air Force engineer, so they traveled quite a bit when they were younger. She was born into a large extended family with tons of cousins, and they got together every holiday just like many of us just did this week, and they took trips together. Eventually, she actually had a baby sister, and I'm just going to use this to like just make some points about her life. So we're born in Biloxi. We have a typical family upbringing. We get a baby sister. And we're talking like, cookies every time you get off the school bus are made. Her mom, wore high heels to clean the house, made sure everything was perfect. Dad would come home from wherever he was assigned at the time, and everything would be in order. And eventually, they ended up moving to Huntsville, Alabama, where her father got a job with NASA. Still very much the typical perfect family. They went to church. They did dance lessons. She was in Girl Scouts. She loved being kind of like a mom figure to her little sister. Life was pretty typical and pretty great. And then when she was 16, she became a cheerleader. She did all the cheerleading things. And then I see one of our Vista Ridge cheerleaders right here. So, right, you want me to try? It's going to be sad if I try. So she does this. She does a cheerleading thing, and then she ends up at 16. Her dad, on her mother's birthday, her dad comes home with a gift wrapped in a bow. And the gift for her mom was divorce papers. Now, at this time, culturally, we navigate the issues of divorce very differently than we do today, right? At this point, culturally, she is asked to leave the church. Everyone that she associates with socially is asked to not spend time with her anymore. And because of the trauma of the event, her mother quickly slipped into a mental health crisis. And so her mother actually ended up needing shock therapy. So at 16 years old, she's driving her mother to and from shock therapy. Fast forward just a couple more years. At 18, she marries her high school sweetheart. They kind of bounce around. They live in Oregon. They live in East Tennessee for a while. They go back to Alabama for a minute. They go to the Memphis area, and they end up landing around Nashville, Tennessee, and she starts to work. She starts to work first as a real estate agent and a stockbroker, and she becomes very good quickly. She's actually the first female agent in one of the Nashville E.F. Hutton branches. And she starts to climb. She's sent to New York to do stuff on Wall Street. Her real estate business is taking off, and she wants to have kids, but about like 3 or 4 miscarriages later, she finally does have one child. She'll try a couple more times to have kids, but she ends up with just one child at the age of 27. She does the mom thing for a couple of years, and then she ends up going back to work, and again, becomes extremely successful, holding it all together. She's doing the PTA kind of thing. She's involved. She's doing all the clubs, all the social organization. She's running her own brokerage firm for real estate now, and so she decides she wants to open a restaurant. So she co-owns a restaurant. They build it, and she starts running that, and she's running, and she's running, and she's running until she can't run anymore. And at age 36, things are starting to kind of shift financially, and the businesses are not doing as well as she expected. And she has a moment where she really truly believes that her child and her husband would be better if she didn't exist anymore. So at age 36, she takes her child to the babysitter, she drops her off, and she leaves to drive back to Biloxi, Mississippi to commit suicide. Along the way, a couple of things happen. Remember, she's fallen out of church because church wasn't too kind when her parents divorced. But something grabs a hold of her, and she decides not to. And then her husband drives down to Biloxi and finds her and brings her back to Nashville, and she begins treatment. Now, we've come a long way with mental health, but we've still got a long way to go. But back then, to have that massive of a failure and that massive of a breakdown, once again, her social structure is flipped upside down. Who she thought were her friends were no longer her friends. She's failed people. She's lost a lot of money. Her parents are disappointed. Her husband is disappointed. And so she enters a period and a season of healing, but also a lot of isolation. And there's so many moments where she's not sure she made the right decision to stay around or not. She discovers art. She decides not to go back into the busy-paced corporate scene. She just starts to do art. She actually starts to teach art classes at a local high school, and then she starts to teach local art classes to small groups of people, and still experiencing life all along the way. Eventually, she ends up becoming a grandmother, and then she actually gets to take the trip of a lifetime to Paris, France, to actually study art in Monet's garden. And there she is. And she continues to have her story unfold. It's not done yet. Now, why do I share that story? I share it because I had a conversation. I have the privilege of working with students here in the Inside Out ministry, and I lead a small group of girls. And I have 2 teenage sons, so I can love teenage girls. And I know parents of teenage girls are like, yeah, sure you can. But I love our conversations. But one time I was having a conversation with one of them, and she mentioned that her mom, and let me just brace yourself for this one, her mom was asking her to do the dishes. And she wasn't in the mood to do the dishes. And she didn't understand why her mom couldn't understand that she didn't want to do the dishes. And she was confessing to me, she's like, I know, I should just do them. I shouldn't give my mom so much attitude. Teenage girls, take note, right? But I asked her, she was talking to me about how she can't understand why her mom sometimes gives her attitude and then she gives attitude back and they go through this thing. And I said, did you remember that your mom we're talking like 3 or 4 years ago, didn't your mom go through a divorce? Well, yeah. Did you think about how she's trying to figure that out still? And I know that you've got your own stuff, and I know that for sure did impact you, but did you stop to remember that your mom had a story before you and a story after you? And she's like, yeah, I guess I kind of think of that. And in that moment, God said to me, do you? Because this story, let me show you where I come in. I fit in right about here because that's my mom's story. And you know, it's funny when you get ready to tell a story about your mom, and I read over this with her, and there's nothing like going home for 2 weeks to remind you while you're preaching about it, you know? Because we forget. You know, what I love in my understanding of God is that God kind of stands outside of all this. So God sees my mom's story and God sees my story. God is not unaware of our story. But I have a limited perspective, right? Even sometimes of my own story. Even trying to think backwards about what might have happened, I can kind of rewrite the story even in my own mind. It's very difficult for me to accurately tell what happened, or even what is going to happen is even more difficult to predict. But God stands outside of it. And there are 2 things I want us to talk about today. One, I want to challenge you and ask you, how well do you know your story? How well do you know your own timeline? And what has shaped you? And what has formed you? And why maybe things in this season could have been impacted by things in this season. Let's just start there. The psalmist, all those great lyrics, right, says so much more just about understanding our timelines. You hem me in, speaking of God. The psalmist says, you hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. I have to stop and think if I'm going to get outside of my story enough to see how God might be moving in it. I know that's not always an enjoyable process, and for some of us that just sounds foolish, but I wonder if there's value. The psalmist continues. He says, all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. God stands outside our story. Now, just a point of clarification, I believe that God gifted us with free will. Unfortunately, with that gift that you've also got, your free will can bump into my free will and irritate me, okay? And I don't think that God ever takes something that's dysfunctional or unhealthy and labels it as good, right? I think that he's very clear on that. But we're at work in free will, and so when God stands outside this, he's like, I see it, and I'm with you in it. Like if I were to actually make this look more like the hills and valleys of my mom's life or of your life, it's not that God is only in the mountaintops or only in the valleys. He's on the entire ride with us. But how well do you know that? There's some sweetness that occurs when you pause and think about your story. And there's also some honesty. If you sit before God and you say, look, this part I don't understand. This part I do struggle with. This part hurt me. You need to know your story. Your story is shaping you. And the more you know it, the more that you are aware of it, the more empowered you will be. The second thing I want to talk about today is how well do you know the story of others? Like really know it, just like my high school girl. Do you realize that with your parents, there was a story before you and after you? As adults, still dealing with adult parents, do you realize that you are a small part of a big story? That your parents had hopes and dreams and thoughts and heartbreak and joys and celebrations and struggles and trials, just like you do, but that actually are not attached to you? Actually, I think I'm trying to convince my teenage sons of this. I am actually a person other than just mom. I have things that worry me. I have things I'm afraid of. I have insecurities that are actually outside you. You don't help them most of the time, but I'm just saying there's also going to be a story after you. Sometimes that can't come soon enough, but sometimes I don't want to let go. Like I'm trying to figure me out while you're trying to figure you out because we are not a merged timeline. We only see a portion of the story. My kids only see a portion of my story, but I only see a portion of my parents' story. You know, I was talking with my friend Elena, and we were talking about this topic and just about our parents in general, and we were just sitting back, and she shared with me a story about when her and her siblings were about to engage dealing with their adult father. And it wasn't necessarily going to be an easy, enjoyable kind of conversation or figuring out that dynamic. So they went to a therapist, and they said, how do we deal with dad? And the therapist said, what I'd like you to do is actually take dad and let him show you around his childhood for a day. Let him drive you to all the places that he grew up and the things that he experienced and the things that he remembered. And they did that. For the whole day, they just drove around and he would say, oh, over on that playground, that's where this happened. Over here is where I first learned about this. And there had been some tension and some dysfunction, and knowing that story didn't erase that. It doesn't declare dysfunctional things healthy, but it created a space for understanding and empathy. It created a moment where she could go, okay, maybe that thing that happened right here when I was in the story makes so much sense when I understand what happened right here. You know, when it comes to dealing with our parents, whether you're young and it's my kids dealing with me or it's me dealing with my adult parents, there's this commandment I've always struggled with. So I wasn't raised in church because, again, remember, church wasn't so much fun for my mom when she was growing up. But I entered into, ministry and really had to learn a lot about the Bible. One of the things I had to learn about were the 10 Commandments, right? This list of essentially kind of 10 guidelines for life from the Old Testament. As I began to read through them, some of them made a ton of sense and were kind of easy to grasp. But this particular one in Exodus kind of was like, oh, I don't really know how I feel about that, God. You're probably familiar with it. Honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land your God is giving you. And I would always hear pastors go, and it's the only one that comes with a promise. And I'm like, I'm not sure if that promise is worth some of what it takes sometimes. Until I started to dig and press into this particular commandment even more. The word honor there is kind of tricky in English. We don't have enough weight, a word that really, masters it well. But it would kind of be better to be described as to be heavy, weighty, or grievous. That it's not honor so much as in like, I have to respect you, because it's tough to feel like you want to honor someone when you can't respect them. It's not honor as much as be excited about you or have big fanfare when you come into town. That's not necessarily the word here either. And it's not necessarily always weighty and grievous, right? Like it's always this big burden to deal with our parent dynamic. But understanding this gave me some clarity around my relationships, right? Like does anybody else maybe feel like understanding that at times engaging with our parents, if it feels a little heavy, that's actually part of it. If it feels a little burdensome, again, not negating difficult things that happen during that time, but you're actually not alone. You're actually not off base if maybe sometimes it's tough to navigate that relationship. I've been leading small groups for a really long time, and I don't know that I've ever been in a small group that didn't have at least 80% of the participants with a tension with their parents on some level. It can be minor tension, all the way to extreme trauma and neglect and abuse. But when we understand that that word honor isn't like skipping through a forest and saying everything's okay, it's got a little bit of weight to it, it kind of changes the story, right? The other thing I want to think about today is you are only in control of one story. Any guesses? Yours. You are only in control of your story. You can only manage one timeline. You cannot manage your parents' timeline. I cannot fully manage my kids' timeline. I'm responsible for parenting. That is something that I will be held accountable for, but I actually can't control what they do with all that effort that I give. Right? I tell the boys all the time, I'm like, I'm accountable for what kind of parent I am. I'm not accountable for what kind of men you become. Because you know why? Because I can't control your story. I can't fix my parents' story. There are so many things I would want for my mom and for my dad. And some of them they just don't want, and that's okay. Even if it grieves me or feels heavy and burdensome, I have to release that because I can only control my story. And if that's true, then this is also true. One of the best gifts we can give our children is to reflect for them someone willing to keep working on their story. If I can't control your story and I can't control my parents' story, even as an adult, and I can't control my kids' story long term, the best thing I can do is show them a story well written. Someone who's trying, who's wanting to at least have some clarity around their own story, who's willing to step into spaces and work on their spiritual growth, work on their financial growth. I mean, like, work on all the things that we say that we want for our kids. The best way I can let them see that is to reflect it. It's not going to be by writing it out for them. If I want compassionate children, am I compassionate? If I want kind children, am I kind? If I want them to have a vibrant marriage, am I working on having a vibrant marriage? If I want them to have amazing friendships, am I showing them what it looks like to have amazing friendships in my home? The best thing I can do for my kids and for myself, and honestly for any timeline that I butt up against, is to work on my own. And then to leave space to recognize that I truly cannot know other people's stories, but I can learn a little more about them. Learning other stories increases empathy. And empathy is our hardwired tool from God that creates space for deeper understanding. You know, it's that going back to that psalmist, right? Psalm 90. Again, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Knowing my story has value, taking the time and being curious enough to learn your story has such extreme value. Because I can only know it in part. Now, I want you to kind of think about someone that's irritating you. Maybe they were at Thanksgiving. Maybe you work with them. Maybe you live with them. Maybe you're in school with them. Or they're just a friendship that's kind of drifted and you're kind of frustrated. I know that sometimes we get so comfortable we forget that there is a story that we are just a small portion of. But there is value in taking the time to consider the story. So 2 things: discovering your story better and considering the story of others is what I think the psalmist is saying. You know, Jesus does this thing too, and I actually try to think of like one scene that was like perfect. Like here's a perfect example of Jesus doing this. But like honestly, it was just like almost every time he encounters someone, he's almost always reframing the way that either they understand the story or the people that bring them understand the story. Right? Like the religious leaders are always bringing an example. Like, look at this. This is this man's blind. Who caused this blindness? And he's like, hey, you guys are missing it. Let me help you understand the story a little better. Or a rich young ruler comes and says, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And he says, let me help you see this story a little better. Or a woman at a well says, there's no way you can actually speak to me. And he says, yeah, but I actually know your story. And I know it in a way, I stand outside it, and I see your worth and value. Jesus remains curious about our stories every time he engages with someone. So 3 things I think that we would benefit from doing. And I think we can even start to do them maybe even today after we leave. First, walk through your story. Now, I know one of the things I love about Northpoint is that they are consistent in reminding us to seek professional help, to honestly, and I'm like a huge fan of counseling, been many, many times, so you can see, But I think that maybe walking through your story with a professional or not, even walking through with a small group leader. In first service, I nominated Buck and Jordan for all the storytellings. Take some time to say, I want to actually consider my story. I want to actually know myself a little better. The psalmist, again, one of those great song lyrics, again, this is the one that we put on pallet wood and we sell it at Hobby Lobby. It says, for I know I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Now, we usually chop it off at I am fearfully and wonderfully made because it fits better to go in a baby nursery. But when the psalmist continues with, I know that full well, that's my question. Do you know full well what is shaping you, what is crafting you, why you respond the way you respond, why that thing triggers you the way it does, why that hurt still aches? Do you know your timeline full well? The next thing that I think we can walk away and do, and I really question how to phrase this, but really it's just pray. And I don't mean it, and I mean it in like a super simple, practical way. Like, let's just think about that person in that meeting that drives you crazy when they speak. Like, what would it look like just inside for you to say, God, I do not really know their story. I don't know that I want to, but I know that you know their story. Help me remember that I don't know. What about that situation you just either feel like you escaped from in your family dynamic that you just had at the holidays, or the one you're about to enter into for Christmas? What about go ahead and asking God to start talking to you about, I don't know their story. I don't know what's actually going on. I shared a story with Jeremy as we were getting ready for this message. I started ministry at 22. That's so young. And at the time, I worked for a church where kind of the culture was, it was a smaller church, like all the staff, all the pastors went in any case of any emergency. And so at 22 years old, I was called week 1 to the ICU downtown because a person in our congregation had an accident. And I arrive, she's a 36-year-old woman. She had 2 small boys. I remember them because I'd volunteered in VBS and done all the things. And she was taking her 2 sons to daycare. It was in a home, and the driveway had an incline. And she was getting her son out of the car, and the emergency brake slipped. And the van came back over her with the boys still in it. And she was crushed. First week of ministry. Way too young to process. The first time I saw anyone pass away before me. First time I had to figure out how to help a grieving family. And in that moment, after everything, all the machines were turned off and everyone had breathed for a second, and it seemed like we were done until the next phase of that process started, all I wanted to do was get home to my husband. I just wanted to get home. I was so young, I didn't even understand what I was processing, and I just needed to get home. So I started in Nashville traffic, similar to Austin traffic, so it's a pain, and I'm driving, and I get behind this car, and it's seriously, I was so frustrated. Now, I'm not prone to road rage, but I was super irritated at this point because I want to get home because I want to see my husband. I want to hug my husband. I just need to get home. And this car is seriously in the way. And so finally, as soon as there was a chance, I was going to swerve around and I was going to give them, in Tennessee, we have a bless your heart face. Do you have that here in Texas? Do you have a bless your heart face? And I swerved around and I looked over to the right, and it was the parents of the young girl that I had just watched passed away. And I thought, it has stuck with me forever that every time I'm frustrated in traffic, I just don't know the story. Every time I have a bad customer service experience, doesn't mean I can't be direct, doesn't mean I can't have honest conversation, but I also don't know their story. And even people that I feel like I've done life with for a while, sometimes there might be this moment that jumps up and grabs them and it impacts me. And if I'm not careful and I'm not constantly saying, okay, God, just help me in this moment, because maybe there's something going on with them. Maybe there's something else happening. And since I can't control their story, help me talk to you about how to navigate their story. And then the third thing, ask for others' stories. Now, this is kind of like leveling up the prayer. It's like, okay, God, help me deal with their stories, and now I'm going to be brave enough to actually engage with a story. Ask, what was it like growing up? Do what Elena did. Take them for a drive. Be curious. How were they raised? What happened all here? And if you entered their story later in life, what happened all throughout before? What happened before and behind on either side? A friend of mine talked about a process he went through with his father, who was doing a 12-step program. And the 12 steps are so great. And one of the steps has you take a fearless inventory of your life, which is kind of the same thing as like, hey, know your own story, right? But it divided it into categories of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then you would share that with people that you were close to. Share with me the good stuff of your life. That's kind of probably the stuff we toss out to everyone. And share with me the bad stuff of your life. Maybe we hold that a little closer, but we give a little more. But the ugly stuff was actually the stuff you don't share, the stuff that hurt you, the reason you struggle. And he shared with me that when his father read that list, he knew the good stuff. He had been around for a chunk of it. He knew some of the bad stuff. He didn't know the ugly stuff. When you understand someone's ugly stuff, you will understand so much more of them. And that doesn't make dysfunctional things okay, but it creates space for empathy and understanding, which is exactly what God is all about. It's exactly why he came into the mess. Like we're about to celebrate Christmas, this idea that God comes into the world to engage with this mess that we've got. And he continues to do that today. He's like, I am already aware of your story. I would love for you to invite me into it. So what does it look like to walk through your story? To pray when you recognize someone else's story is bumping up against you and it's creating some tension? And are there a couple of stories you might benefit from learning from? That's what I want us to think about today. I'm going to pray for us. Father, I thank you that you are not unaware of our story, that you fashioned us together, you hem us in before and behind, and this timeline thing that can get so messy, that you are fully aware. Any space that we need to become more aware, help us to do so. Help us to have the courage to know ourselves full well. And beyond that, help us to understand that we are a small portion of someone else's big story where you are at work, that I will literally never look on someone else that you don't love. And that as I get curious about other stories and give space, not that you would have us not have healthy boundaries or that you would justify anything that wasn't from you, but God, that you would just give us breathing room to be able to see and to have eyes of empathy and to deepen our understanding, not only of them and their story, but ourselves and ultimately of you. We give you our story. Help us to write a good one. Amen. Thank you guys so much. We'll be back next week to start our Christmas series.